Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the National Family Support Technical Assistance Center's webinar. Who is Caring for You? Secondary Trauma and Self-Care with Sue Badeau. I'm Gail Cormier, the Project Director of NAFSTAC, the Family Center of Excellence. We are proudly led by the National Federation of Families, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. Before we introduce our speaker, I would like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar is being recorded. The recording, along with the PowerPoint presentation, slides, and any additional resources, will be sent via email within 3 to 5 days to all who have registered. If you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, please type your comment in the chat box on the right side of your screen, and someone will be able to assist you. In order for us to have an engaging and interactive session today, I want to invite you to type your questions in the chat box for Sue. And if we have time at the end of the presentation, we'll ask as many as we can. We'll be watching the chat during the entire presentation and recording your questions to be answered. So please ask as many questions you want, just put them in that chat box. The webinar will end 5 minutes before the scheduled conclusion. We ask that you take this 5 minutes to complete a short feedback survey using the link provided. This survey will help us continuously improve our webinars, and it also fulfills our SAMHSA funding obligation to provide them with the important data that is required by our company. Please note, all information will be confidential and we will respect your privacy. We do not offer CEU credits for our webinars, but we will send you a letter of attendance within 3 to 5 days after the presentation. I would like to thank SAMHSA for allowing us to share this information with you today. And again, thank you for joining us. I will now turn it over to NAFSTAC's Principal Investigator and the Executive Director of the National Federation of Families, Linda Goggin. Linda? Well, it appears that Linda may not be here at the moment, so I'll introduce Sue. Sue writes and speaks extensively on topics related to the children, particularly those with special needs, and is a frequent keynote speaker and workshop leader at state, regional, and national conferences. Sue and her husband Hector are lifetime parents of 22 children, 2 by birth and 20 adopted. Some of her children have mental, physical, and intellectual or emotional challenges. Sue holds a degree in early childhood development and elementary education from Smith College. She has worked in child-serving fields, including adoption, foster care, juvenile justice, children's mental health, and public and private education agencies for 33 years. Sue serves on national boards of the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, the North American Council of Adopted Children, National Center for Youth in Custody, All Children, All Families, and Justice for Families. To learn more about Sue and her family, we invite you to visit her family website at www.badeaufamily.com. You will find the link in your chat box. I will now be happy to turn it over to Sue to begin the webinar. And again, thank you for coming.
Good morning or afternoon, everyone, depending where you're located around the country. I've been watching the names pop in on the box, the chat box, as people are joining. And it's so great to see so many of you from all over the country. I will note that Kelsey did remark in the chat box, we are working to get the dinging stopped. I can't turn the sound off or you won't hear me, and then we won't get anywhere with that. So I know that Kelsey's working on the settings to see if we can stop that dinging. So we do appreciate that several of you did mention that. But I have my camera on just for the moment so I could, you could see me, that I'm a real person here to talk to you today. But I am also going to turn mine off, especially when we have such a large group, which is just exciting and fantastic, but it does mean that we need to all do our part to make sure that we keep strong connection and bandwidth. And part of that is by keeping everyone on mute and keeping the cameras off as much as possible so we can hear and then see the PowerPoint slides. And I just want to emphasize what Gail said during her introductions, that even with such a large group as this, we want it to be as interactive as possible. This is an important topic to have some interaction. I'm going to go ahead and put this slide up next. But so please do use that chat. I appreciate that everyone is using it to sign in. That's terrific. And please use it to add comments, reflections, thoughts, or to post questions. And of course, we will then get to as many of the questions as we can as we either go along or at the end, as mentioned. But there will also be times when I will ask you, does anyone have a reflection or a thought about something that I've just said or posted? So please do, during those moments when I ask for those reflections, please do go ahead and type your response to that into the chat box. I won't be able to read out all of them or mention every single one that I see, but I will be keeping track of them, as will our other co-hosts, and occasionally highlighting a few, but also it'll be there for all of you to engage with one another in that way. And then one other strategy I'll be using for engagement will also be the polling function that Zoom has. And probably by this time, after we've been in a virtual world for over a year now, pretty much, with the COVID requirements and restrictions, you probably have been on Zoom enough that you know about using the polling function. But just in case you don't, I wanted to mention that when I pose a poll in question, you will see it come up on your screen, and then you'll be able to respond to it on your screen on your device. And I won't see the names of who responded with what answer. I will just see the aggregate, and that's what I'll share back with all of you. So it is a way of engaging, but it's also anonymous. If your device doesn't allow you to see or respond to the polls, don't worry, you won't be left out, because I will also read them aloud when I post them, so that anyone who can't see them in that moment on their screen also will hear me reading them aloud. So that's what I wanted to say in the way of some additional introduction. And I'm just excited to be with you all today. And I love starting with this particular slide, because I don't know about you, but this is kind of how my life has felt for many years, really, as a parent of children with special needs and challenges, as a volunteer and advocate in my community, as well as a person with full-time employment. I'm just always juggling, right? So many balls and multitasking in so many different ways. And so when I found this particular image, I said, yes, this is what my life looks like. So I don't know if, as you live your life and you are caring for others, advocating for others, doing your work, doing your job, maintaining relationships, learning new things, if you feel like this kind of describes your life too. But in the midst of all of this, where and when is time for ourselves, right? And yet, as the old adage about being on the airplane goes, certainly if we do not take care of ourselves first, we will certainly not be able to care for others. So what I'm going to be sharing with you in our time together today are some definitional foundational things, so we're kind of all on the same page about why do we even need this care, self-care, and why do we need to focus on it at a time such as this. And then I'm going to share some very fundamental self-care strategies, because what I want here, what I want you to take away from our time together today, is the idea that self-care is not some luxury that you can get to it when you get to it. And it's not some thing that you need a whole day or a whole weekend or months of planning or expensive resources or tickets or childcare, all those things to go off on a vacation or a spa day or anything like that. As wonderful as those things can be, by the end of our time together today, I want you to see that there are strategies you can use right in your everyday, day-to-day workday life that take moments, just moments of your time, take basically no cost at all, and yet really build your self-care and wellness and thriving and resilience. And these are some words I'll be using more than once and also defining as we go along. We want you to not just to survive, but to thrive. And so everything that I will be sharing with you today in terms of strategies around self-care, after we get through some of the definitional piece at the beginning, these strategies are all things that have actually a research base. They have evidence behind them that if you engage in these questions, these daily sort of reflective questions that I'll be sharing with you, and then if you, as you engage in the reflective question, if you also do the little activity that might be prompted by that question, these are all things that have a research and evidence base that you will, in fact, build up your resilience, be doing self-care, be providing for your own wellness and thriving and healing. And again, as I said, with very little investment of time or money, but just with an investment of intention. So that's what I really want you to be thinking about as we go forward into our time together today. So with that said, I'm going to ask you to take a look at these terms that, or concepts that are ways that we all adjust or address and cope and manage or deal with, to some extent, stress, but especially when there's a lot going on, when there's crisis, when there's change, when there's transition, when there's things that are just really difficult going on. There's these different ways that people respond, and they're not mutually exclusive. So that's why the last button at the bottom says all or several of these. I'm going to just mention briefly what each of these words, intends, what it's about in terms of responding to stress or crisis. And then I want to ask you to consider and think about, do you recognize yourself in any of these as I describe them? And if you do, and if you're comfortable with sharing some of that in the chat box, this would be a great one of those times to put some reflection in the chat box so that, again, for engagement with one another. Do you recognize yourself in any of these? You might notice that you lean maybe more towards one than the other, but again, remember, they're not mutually exclusive. So it can certainly be that you recognize yourself in several or even all of them at different times. So, and some of you are already jumping in. That's terrific. The fixer mentality is when there's a crisis, when there's a problem, I want to solve that problem. I want to make it better. I want to fix it for myself or for others. I want to fix the circumstance. And then a fighter is the one who there's a problem, there's a crisis, and I want to fight against it. And a fighter mentality is often what goes into being an advocate, into advocacy, being that champion for others. So a fixer and a fighter, very closely related. And for people that have these tendencies, the past year has been particularly difficult because what is there to fix? The problems and crises of pandemic, global pandemic, of racial injustice, of economic challenges, of the health-related issues that go beyond COVID, and climate and weather crises that have happened around the country. They're all so big that it can seem like, well, where do I even tackle? How do I fix? What do I fight? It's challenging. So, so if you recognize yourself in that, but you find that it's been especially hard this past year, that could be part of the reason why. Now, just as the fixer and fighter sort of go hand in hand, or are sort of two sides of the coin, soothing and seeking are also another pair that kind of work that way. But they're more along the lines of what I call a continuum, where everyone, when facing stress, loss, grief, trauma, any of these challenges, everyone needs that soothing, that calming, that healing. The question is, in terms of how do you recognize yourself, the question is, do you recognize when you need that? And then are you able to seek self-soothing or seek resources for soothing? And are you able to be one that can help provide that soothing and calming for others? Or are you more along the end of the continuum where you don't recognize you need it, you don't recognize you need it until you get to a place where you're really overwhelmed and overloaded? Or maybe you don't recognize so much yourself when you need it, but you recognize it in others or vice versa. So that's a continuum kind of thing. And the seeker means seeking help, seeking support, seeking resources. And it's the same kind of thing. It is a continuum that, we all are in professions and personal lives here in this webinar today. We are all either through our personal life or our profession in roles of being that caregiving role, in that helper role, in that helping profession role. And so we know how important it is for others to seek out help when they need it. But the question is, are we the ones that know when we need it ourselves? Are we able to do that? Where do we fall on that continuum? So that's an important piece to know yourself and recognize. Now, the adapter is one, like, whereas the fixer and the fighter are focused outwardly, like there's a problem and I'm going to somehow change it, I'm going to solve it, or I'm going to fight against it. The adapter is the same kind of process, but it's more turning inward. It's more saying, okay, things have changed. There's a crisis. There's something brewing out there in the world. How do I adapt to it? What do I have to do to adapt to, as you may have heard this phrase so much in the past year, this new normal, right? And there's a lot of uncertainty about that. What is the new normal? Are we in it now? What is it going to look like when it gets here? Are we going to go back to an old normal? Do we want to go back to an old normal? How do we adapt to these new things? But are they going to change yet again? Are we holding our breath with uncertainty? Is the ground continually shifting under us? That makes adapting feel particularly hard in these kinds of times that we're in. Now, the ride-it out person is the one who might seem to look like and appear in every which way that you're kind of doing nothing. You're kind of doing nothing in the face of the storm, in the face of the challenge, the problem, the crisis. But underneath that, it's not really about doing nothing. It is about hunkering down and riding out the storm, which can be a very, very healthy response at times. So don't rule that one out as negative. In fact, none of these are negative. And as I said earlier, none are mutually exclusive. It's just valuable to recognize yourself, recognize that they're all normal responses. So when you see them in yourself or in others, to be able to give grace and space to say, okay, just because someone else responds differently to this crisis or this challenge than I do, doesn't mean that they have a handle on it. They've got the right way. They've got the better way. And I should beat myself up because I just don't. It doesn't mean that on the one hand, but it also doesn't mean the reverse of that. Like, oh, I've kind of got it together. I've got this figured out, but look at that person. They're not coping well. They're not dealing well. But rather, when we're able to kind of recognize that these are all normal ways that people respond, we can sort of calibrate our own self-care, but also how we interact and relate with others. Now, before we go off this slide, and you might have wondered why the words are just, down the middle like that, I just have a couple of pictures I'm going to post around the edges here, because this is another way of thinking about this. How do we respond in times of trial, challenge, crisis, etc. And so several of you have chimed in on the chat box, and I really appreciate that in terms of how do you recognize yourself in how I describe the descriptions I gave with the words. And maybe those didn't quite resonate with some of you. Perhaps these pictures will make it a little more something that connects with you. These are 4 examples of things you can put into boiling water, and the process of putting the item into the boiling water creates some kind of reaction or change. So when you put an egg, which is very fragile, and if you knock an egg off your counter, it breaks, it's a mess all over the place, it's very, doesn't have any substance to it. It just all comes out. But you put that egg in boiling water and you boil it for 10 minutes and then it hardens up. The fact of being in the boiling water hardens it up, toughens it up, makes it stronger. Some of us are like that when we're in crisis. That as fragile as we might see, or as overwhelmed, or things that we might see before the crisis, getting into that hot water, getting into that boiling water can in fact be something that actually we respond to in a way that strengthens us or toughens us or hardens us. Then we have the potato, and the potato is already pretty tough and hard, but when you put it into boiling water, it softens it. It's not until you boil or in some other way cook the potato that it becomes soft enough to eat, but it softens it and makes it more receptive to whatever else you might add to it, like that butter or sour cream or bacon. But so some of us are those that, crisis, we might have kind of that hard shell on the exterior. We might just barrel through things, but crisis or challenge, they soften us. They give us more empathy. They give us more of the opportunity to connect with others and kind of receive those added resources of the butter and the sour cream and the chives or whatever it might be. Now I'm going to go over to the stones, and the stones you can put into the hot water and they get hot. They get hot, but they don't fundamentally change. Either the water or the stone is not fundamentally changed as a result of being in the hot water. The stone gets hot, and while it's hot, it can be useful. It can you can cook food on hot stones. You can give massages with hot stones. Hot stones can be useful, but then a little while afterwards, they're right back to their original state. They're cooled down again. Neither the stone itself nor the water has been fundamentally changed by that process. And finally, the one that's kind of my favorite, if I can say that, is the coffee, because the coffee beans, when you put them into the hot water, they change, but most importantly, they transform the water. They transform the environments around them. And so that's another option of how some of us might respond in times of being in that boiling water, being thrust into crisis or challenge. And maybe we're somewhat fundamentally changed, but also we then flavor and change the water, the environment around us, our family, our coworkers, our clients, our community, our neighborhood is fundamentally changed for the better because we were in their world during that time of crisis. So those are just the words, and the illustrations are just all different ways that we respond in times like this. And knowing yourself then helps you figure out of all the different self-care strategies, some of which I'm sharing in our time together, and some of which will be things you learn in other ways, things you read about or hear about in other seminars. But when you're evaluating self-care strategies, starting with this know yourself concept helps you figure out what's going to work best for me. So that's why I wanted to kick us right off with that. Now, as I said, we are going to look at some definitions. So just so we're kind of all on the same page and we understand especially the purpose and the reason why we need to really have this intentional focus on self-care. So first, our lives are filled with stress, right? We have stress in our personal lives, stress in our professional lives, stress in our community or volunteer lives. And sometimes if I ask people, would you like to have a life without stress? Lots of times people say, oh yeah, that would be awesome. But actually not really, not so much, because we all need positive stress in our lives. So there's at least 3 different kinds of stress: positive, tolerable, toxic. And toxic is also referred to sometimes as trauma. So I'll be saying a bit more about that in the next few slides ahead. But positive stress is something that we actually need. It energizes us, it excites us, it promotes growth. So it's not just that it's positive, take it or leave it. It's like we really need it to thrive and survive. So I'm going to go on and give a quick definition of the other 2 on here. But while I'm doing that, I would love it if some of you would type into the chat box, what do you think are some examples of positive stressors, things that create stress, but that are positive stress? Meanwhile, while you're typing some of those in or thinking of something to type in, okay, we've got some good ones already coming along, and they're great. Having a new child come into the family, lining up a new job or getting a promotion on your job, or just a challenge at your job, right? All of those things, planning a wedding or other event. And there's many more that several of you have posted in here. So keep using those, meeting a deadline, or anything that involves a tryout, right? Trying out for a play or a job or a team, auditioning, anything that involves sort of a tryout or audition would also fit in this category. I haven't seen anything come up in the chat box that I would disagree with or that I would tell you not to include on this list. So these are all great examples of positive stress. Yeah, I think a few of us will take that lottery winning stress, right? Tolerable stress is when it's still something that we don't need. It's not in the same category that you need it for growth. We could grow and live a perfectly happy life without the tolerable stress, but no one gets that opportunity because tolerable stress is a common, normal human experience. It's the natural reaction we have to difficulty or negative experiences. And there's really no way to live a life without having some of it. But the key word there, tolerable, is that through our normal coping mechanisms and our normal natural support network that we have, just again, naturally in life, we are then able to tolerate those kinds of stresses. So a few things that some of you put in, a car wreck, I think someone put in, or maybe losing a job, or having to a breakup of a relationship, or things like that, are often more in the tolerable stress category, that we can manage them, we can get through them with our natural coping mechanisms, but they're not so much in the positive category. Now, when we get down to toxic stress, it really does go over into the realm of trauma, and I will have a couple of separate slides to define trauma, but the reason it's here on this, what makes stress toxic, the toxicity of it, is when we cannot cope with it using our normal and natural coping mechanisms and natural support network. It overwhelms our capacity. So part of self-care that we're talking about today is that we want to strengthen our capacity internally so that we can respond to many of the things, and so fewer things fall into that toxic bucket and more of them get kind of kicked up to the tolerable bucket, because we have flexed our muscle and increased our capacity to be able to tolerate things that maybe previously might have been toxic to us. So now, as we continue on looking at a few other definitions before I start addressing giving self-care strategies, lots of time, part of what causes stress is loss. And loss in general, this definition that I'm sharing with you here, being deprived of someone or something of value to you. And often that deprivation of that something or someone happens when it either leaves us or is taken from us. But especially, as noted at the bottom of the slide, in ways that are unanticipated and may seem to be unrecoverable. That's what kicks it into grief, which we're going to go to next. And that's what a lot of us have been facing in the past year. Losses that have been taken from us, people that have been taken from us through death, through the past year, people that have been taken from us for other ways or other reasons, jobs that we've lost, school graduations or proms that our kids have lost. These are just a few examples of things that have either been taken from us or left us, and that we did not anticipate at all. And many of them, some of them clearly are unrecoverable if someone you love has passed away, for example. Others, we're just not sure yet. We're just not sure if we're going to be able to recover. So it really does add some challenge. And it takes us into the realm of grief. So we're going to start with the first of the poll questions that I mentioned earlier, just to get you all a little more engaged here. So I'm launching it now. You should see it on your screen, but as I promised, I'm also going to read it aloud. Grief is a process with recognizable stages, which, and if you can't reply on your screen, please feel free to use the chat using these answers that I'm going to offer you. Grief is a process with recognizable stages, which A, proceed in a linear fashion, B, are not linear and can be experienced differently by different people, C, only occur after death, other losses are not experienced as grief, or D, generally lasts about a year. So I do see that we've had just about half of you respond to the poll, which is fabulous. I'm going to leave it up for about 10 or 15 more seconds to let some more of you weigh in, and then we'll share the collective responses, the aggregated responses. Great, we're over 2/3, so just about 10 more seconds and then I'll close it out. Okay, great stuff. We did get about 3/4 of you almost, but I am going to close it now and share the results. So, although a few people noted some of the other answers, the vast majority did correctly get the answer that the stages of grief are not linear and can be experienced differently by different people. Sometimes, for whoever did check the linear answer, sometimes for some people they might proceed in that linear manner. So that's not a wrong answer. It's just not the most frequent answer. And certainly we often talk about grief as being associated with death, which is why that answer is also not really wrong, because grief is associated with death, but there are other things and circumstances and situations that people do grieve over beyond death. The generally lasting about a year is not also, is also not a completely wrong answer. It's often thought that grief, particularly grief related to death, takes almost a year to kind of work through the stages, but then it lingers long after that as well. It's something that in the integration and acceptance stage kind of stays with us for a long time. So while that might be conventional wisdom of sort of grief being a year-long process, it's really variable for people. I am going to stop sharing that one, and we're going to do one more poll before I continue with sharing the definitions. And this is a particular kind of grief. Particular kind of grief. I just want to see how familiar you may or may not be with it. It's called ambiguous grief. It occurs when A, you're not sure why you're grieving, or B, there's nothing to grieve about, but you're down or depressed anyway. C, the stages of grief are just not progressing for you, or D, you are experiencing a loss not acknowledged by others. So we've gotten about 20% of you weighing in so far. I'm going to leave it up at about another 20 seconds to get more of you in on this one. Okay, we've gotten up to about 2/3, so I'm just going to leave it about 10 more seconds. Great. All right, we're going to close this one out and share the results. And this one was a little more tricky, maybe. So we have people that offered all the possible answers, and so they all can ring a little bit true. But we're going to acknowledge that the actual answer is the fourth one. You're experiencing a loss not acknowledged by others. So I will say a bit more about that in a moment. But all of the other answers, certainly sound like they could be somewhat ambiguous and relate to our topic. But the actual answer is a loss not acknowledged by others. So I'll take those off for now and bring us over to the stages of grief, originally as defined by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and David Kasser. And as most of you noted in the poll response, these are not linear, generally, can be for some people, and they don't have a certain timeline in which we feel them. But in this past year with the pandemic, it has provided a useful way of understanding what many of us are going through individually as well as collectively, and why then the self-care really needs to kind of be amped up a little bit. So we have, you can see them there. I don't need to read them aloud to you, but what I do want to read aloud to you is David Kasser, one of the original authors who worked with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross on this, wrote an article, or was interviewed for an article that was published in the Harvard Business Review right at the beginning of the quarantines and everything a year ago, last March. And it's still very relevant now. Many of you perhaps may have even read the article. It's been circulated a lot in the past year. But I just want to read you a paragraph out of it where he talks about how using these stages of grief helps us understand kind of what everyone's going through in terms of the pandemic. So the question that the author asked him is, what can individuals do to manage what we're going through? And he says, we feel that there's something bad out there. With a virus, this kind of grief is confusing for people. Our primitive mind knows something bad is happening, but we can't see it. So it breaks our sense of safety. We're feeling this loss of safety. Kasser, I don't think we've collectively lost our sense of general safety like this before in any of our memory. Individually or as smaller groups, people have felt this, but all together, this is new. We're grieving on a micro and macro level. Understanding the stages of grief is a beginning way to help us manage it. But whenever I talk about the stages of grief, I have to remind people that the stages aren't generally linear and may not happen in this order. Therefore, it's not a map, but it does provide some scaffolding for this unknown world. So let's just look at how they play out in terms of the pandemic. So there was denial, right? Especially at the beginning, or even now as we're sort of coming, what we think and hope might be that we're coming out of it a little bit, but there can be denial still. Like, this virus, it's not going to affect me. It's not going to affect my loved ones. It's over there somewhere. It's not where I am, or it's over now. So there's a lot of denial. Then there can be anger when people say, oh, you're making me, you're taking away my activities. I can't do things that I like to do, or I have to do things I don't want to do, like wearing a mask. And so there can be that getting angry. There can also be guilt or shame if, I didn't do something, social distance or wear a mask, and then I found out someone else got sick. Was I part of that? Do I have guilt? Do I have shame related to that? There's bargaining. Okay, at the beginning, right, we all thought the quarantine times were going to be 2 weeks and done. So there was some of that bargaining, like, all right, I can do this. I can quarantine. I can wear masks for 2 weeks, and then everything will be good again, right? But then everything wasn't and isn't good again. And so that's when people can fall into the sadness, depression, or despair. I just don't know when this will end. Somewhere along the way, at least for some or many, there's a move then into the acceptance, integration with our lives, and possibly making meaning of it, which I will also describe a little more when we get to resilience. All right, it's happening. How do I proceed? What do I have to do? So that's just a way that using these stages of grief can help us to understand what's going on in the current environment with the pandemic. So then that describes what we might call, oops, sorry there. I just did something I didn't mean to do. Let's see if I can. All right, those parts that I just read out loud to you there, you just saw them on the screen. But anyway, so that is what we might call the normal stages of grief. It's highlighted in quote marks because, as was mentioned, it's going to be different for different people in different ways, different timelines, etc. But also it's important to know that there's more than one kind of grief. And so some of the other kinds of grief include these that I've listed here. These are not the only ones. These just happen to be the ones I'm going to share with you today because they're the most relevant in our current work and world. So there's the ambiguous grief, which I asked you about in the poll, and which the definition is a loss that is not acknowledged by others. And Brene Brown, who does a lot of work on empathy, and you can look up her writings or her videos on YouTube and watch them. But she talks a lot about the at least response. If someone shares something with you, or you even are starting to feel some of your own issues, some of your own pain, some of your own loss, and the response that comes to mind is, well, at least it's not as bad as someone else has it, or at least it's not this, or at least it's not that. That's when you're kicking into that ambiguous kind of grief. You're disenfranchising the grief either of yourself or of someone else. You're saying, that loss isn't that important. And so people then who feel that, or if we do that to ourselves, we don't take care of ourselves, we don't grieve, we don't give grace and space, we don't do what's needed to get through it. So it's important to recognize that, yes, some people are experiencing death and loss of their company that they worked their whole life to develop and things like this. And that is huge and that is painful. And if you're experiencing the loss of your daughter who's a junior in high school, can't go to her prom because of the pandemic, that may not be a death, but it's still a loss. It still merits being respected, being honored, being grieved. So we have a lot of those ambiguous losses happening in the past year, and why we need self-care for those. Anticipatory is really when we are kind of waiting for that next shoe to drop. What's going to happen next? Something is bad out there lurking. I just don't see it yet. And then collective grief, right? When there is such a big crisis or series of crises going on in the world that we're all kind of collectively experiencing, and yet we don't experience them all equally. There's inequities, there's racial inequities, there's economic inequities, there's age and generational based inequities in who gets this virus or who doesn't get it, or who gets worse or better more easily, and so on. So there's a lot of inequities. So even though there is a collective sense of grief, there's not a collective response to the grief, and we have to keep that in mind. Now, I mentioned that toxic stress is also another way of describing trauma. And so I'm just going to go a few slides here about trauma so that we can understand how that might be impacting us and how that relates to the type of self-care strategies that we want to engage in. So we have different terms here on the slide that you may have heard of that have been used. I know somebody put into the chat earlier that PTSD term. So these are different types of ways trauma has been referred over the years. PTSS might be less familiar to some people. It's post-traumatic slave syndrome. It's related to collective and historic and multi-generational trauma. And when we think about who can experience trauma, we know that trauma can be experienced by individual children or adults, as well as by whole families and communities, and as well as across multiple generations. And there are and can be many different kinds of trauma that we face. And it's when they kind of all happen at once in our own life or the lives of the people we care about and work with that we get really challenged. I've pictured them all as storms because trauma does seem to sort of invade our reality like a storm, right? And so you have the acute trauma, which is that one-time type of situation. You have chronic, which is when trauma is repeated over and over and over, either the same exact kind of trauma, like a child who gets bullied, or multiple traumas that just you keep having different trauma because you live in a neighborhood that's riddled with violence and illness and economic challenges and addictive challenges. So there's different ways chronic trauma can play out. Complex trauma is when someone or some entity who is supposed to protect you, whose job, whose role is protection and care, ends up being the one who harms you. So when it comes to children, we often think about child abuse and neglect, and children that are harmed by their own parents or relatives as fitting that complex trauma definition, and it certainly does. But it's anyone that has a role of protection and care. So if you're a counselor, if you're a therapist, if you're a teacher, if you're a coach, if you're a priest or a pastor or a imam or a rabbi, if you're in law enforcement, if you're in any of those roles, your job is you have a flock or you have clients or you have a family or you have a community that you're supposed to protect. And if you don't, if you're the one that harms them, that makes the trauma more complex. And then we have both race-based and historic or multi-generational trauma, which carry across history, across communities, across multiple times and places and spaces. And then I'm going to ask you a poll question about secondary trauma, but I am going to note that a few people have mentioned, yes, and a parent goes in the complex trauma, absolutely. That was the first one I started with, and then I wanted to definitely add those other ones, but you're absolutely right, Melissa. And Sherry has noted that trauma often is a combination, absolutely. And so we often have a combination of all of these storms going on at once. Now, I'm going to do a quick poll question about secondary trauma, just to see how we're defining it. And so secondary trauma is either A, less severe than primary trauma, B, not something children experience, C, something that results from continuous or frequent exposure to other people's trauma, or D, happens when you have a memory of a past trauma. So just go ahead and respond to that. We've gotten about a third of you so far. I'll leave it up about 15 more seconds or so. All right, we've got about 2/3 of you replied. I'm going to give it about 10 more seconds and then I'll cut it off. All right, we're going to close this one out just so that we can keep moving along and share those results. And yes, this is excellent that so many of you know that secondary trauma does result from continuous or frequent exposure to other people's trauma. And the thing I want to, and now I'm going to move us on to the next slide to continue talking about that. Frequent or continuous exposure to other people's trauma. It's that frequent or continuous nature of it. It can feel like a bombardment. Has anyone felt that way? Like you've been bombarded, especially in the past year. But it's the frequent or continuous exposure that makes it so difficult. Yes, and some of you are already putting yes, yes, yes in the chat box that yes, you relate to that. And so people in our field, both the personal lives that many of us have, as well as the professional fields that we're in, are at high risk and vulnerability for this. And we're going to look more at that in a moment. And as one of my friends who teaches about this a lot says, it's not the one case or the one family member or the one circumstance that was so overwhelming that we just can't get it out of our mind. We can never forget it. That's not in itself what generally creates secondary traumatic stress. It's that all the hundreds that you can't even remember. It's just that frequent and continuous bombardment that we have with other people's trauma. Now, I'm going to post this slide and you can be looking at it about the definitions that I'm going to highlight for a moment here. But while I do, I just want to say that there's a question that I saw that someone wrote that I didn't want to save to the end. I just wanted to respond now. Bridget mentioned, is complex chronic trauma a real thing? And the answer would absolutely be yes. So complex, if the perpetrator is someone who's supposed to care for you, a parent, a therapist, a priest, anybody, law enforcement, you know, all those different categories I mentioned. And then chronic, if it keeps happening again and again. So complex and chronic can definitely be combined, and that is absolutely a real thing. Now, everything we've been talking about, and as we're focusing now more on the secondary trauma because we're moving into the pieces about self-care, we often hear it used, and these words often used somewhat interchangeably about burnout, vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and then secondary trauma. But what I want to call your attention to are also the strengths that can come, the strengths that can develop as a result of this exposure. And think back to that coffee, the coffee beans in the boiling water, for example. So we can be transformed not only in ourselves, but others around us, and develop greater empathy, greater compassion, greater resilience, and growth. through this. Now, that doesn't happen automatically, but if you participate in some of the kinds of things that I'm going to spend the rest of this webinar talking about, then that's when it helps you to have those benefits of moving from the challenges into the strengths. So all of these things, stress, grief, loss, and trauma, impact us across all of our domains, across our thoughts and our cognition and how we think and understand, across our feelings and our body, our actual physiological body responses, as well as our emotional responses in our feelings and how we perceive and interpret, which then of course leads to action and behavior, what we do with what we know and how we feel. And so most of the time when we have a crisis, a stress, a trauma, we go into survival mode, and then we can go into survival mode at that moment, at that point of loss, grief, or trauma, but we can also go into it when we're re-triggered, when we're triggered to re-experience or relive that trauma. It also sends us into survival mode. And I'm sure that many of you are very familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze triune way that the survival mode has often been described, that intention to, fight against it, flee from it, run from it, or just kind of shut down. And these are all instinctual. These are not thought out. Your brain is not making a choice. Well, today I think I'll do this one or that one. It's very instinctual. It's very survival oriented. It just occurs without that cognition happening in the interim. It's very quick. So let's just quickly look at the other words that are listed here as well, because these are also survival brain reactions or responses. Flock, that times when you just feel this need to be with others, to be with your people, to be with those people that are most like you. Sometimes you might notice this when you hear about a crisis in the world, a school shooting or something, and you suddenly want to be home with your own kids. The shooting may not have happened in anywhere near your community. It might be thousands of miles away, but you have this sudden instinct that you just need to be physically together. Of course, this being physically together has been particularly challenged in the past year, but that's that flock instinct. That flap or frenzy instinct is when the brain is in hyper vigilant, hyper aroused, hyper alert, but yet not yet directed into the fight response or the flight response. It's not frozen, it's not shut down, it's hyper aroused, but it's kind of flapping and frenzied. It has unfocused energy, and maybe some of you have noticed having some unfocused energy in the past year in particular. The fawn response is when your brain instinct, again, instinctual, not thought out, not chosen as a response, but when your brain instinct says to survive this particular trauma, this particular stress, my best way of survival is to do nothing but please the perpetrator. So it's different than freezing. Freezing is kind of literally shutting down and playing dead almost. But the fawn is, I'm going to have no voice. I'm not going to argue. I'm not going to fight. I'm not going to flee. I'm not going to have a voice. I'm going to please the one who's harming me. And again, not thought out, not with intention. It's just your brain clicks into that mode and determines that that's your best option for survival. And then we all know about fatigue at this point in time. Now, here's what several of these, here's what these type of trauma responses look like in real time in terms of a behavior associated with each of these. So I've just listed a few, 2 or 3 behaviors related to each of these survival brain mechanisms, just so you can see how they play out. So it's not an all-inclusive list by any means. It just gives you, from going from that language about survival into, well, what does this look like in real life? And so this is to give you the examples of some behaviors like, oh, if someone is lying, that's interesting. Lying can be an example of flight, right? Because you're kind of like fleeing reality. It can be an example of the survival instinct of flight. So that's just picking one of the examples off the slide here to share that with you. So as we think now, move more into our secondary trauma so we can do our self-care, we have to recognize our own symptoms. The symptoms come in these 3 different clusters, is how they're often identified. There's a great resource there that I've linked on the slide that you can get more information if you wish by going to that particular website. But these symptoms often come in the areas of intrusion, often also described as intrusive thoughts. An example of this is a person whose job was to type reports for caseworkers. But she said, all I do is type the reports for the caseworkers, but then I have dreams about what I've typed, okay? The abusive information about in the reports is intruding even into her dreams. So intrusive thoughts, intrusive dreams. Avoidance, when you find yourself avoiding certain places, people, types of situations, maybe clients. It's also when we kind of have a sense of that foreboding or numbness and detachment about us. And then hyper arousal is that just being on hyper alert, hyper aware, hyper aroused all the time. So you can be more irritable, you can be more suspicious, you can be easily startled, you can have difficulty concentrating. So those are some of what that cluster looks like. And there's a great book called Trauma Stewardship that really goes into some of this a little more detail as well, if you want to look at that. And to answer the question about where did the other survival labels come from, fawn or frenzy, I believe I had on the slide, and let's see if I did. Let's go back a minute. No, I didn't. Okay, well, I will, there are some citations. I don't know why they weren't on the bottom of the slide. I apologize for that, but I will make sure that you have them. I will send them out. So there are researchers that have been working in these areas and have given us these labels. So Dr. Brian Miller is the source mainly for the flock and the flap and frenzy, and Pete Walker is the source for the fawn. So you can definitely get more information about that by looking, reading material from them if you look them up. Dr. Brian Miller and Pete Walker. And they definitely can be commingled, absolutely. So this secondary traumatic stress affects us across all of our domains of being, right? And affects us in our how we think, how we feel, how we act, but also our spiritual and sense of meaning around life, and as well as our interpersonal relationships and our physical well-being. And this affects us in our profession in these kinds of ways that are listed here. And this is where I wanted to highlight that people who work in any kind of children's related services, child welfare, children's mental health, special education and schooling, children's physical health, family services where you're working with families who have children, in all the different arenas and family centers and things that you all posted that you're part of. People in those professions are at higher risk of secondary traumatic stress because there's often the life or death nature involving children, and that intensifies the level of how it affects us. And it can affect our professional functioning, as you can see here, as well as our critical thinking and capacity to even recognize what's an emergency and what's not. So here are a few examples, and like has been said in the chat a few times, when you get the handouts, yes, you will be getting the PowerPoint, you will be getting the handouts, and then you will get these links that you will be able to use. You'll be getting all of that in an email after today is over. But these are just a few examples of some ways that you can do some self-assessment. This is all part of that, you're going to see me give you with some ABCs in a moment. This is part of the A part about having awareness of yourself so that you can then best implement your self-care plan. And absolutely working with people who are currently homeless or terminally ill are two other examples of ways that we have increased vulnerability to secondary trauma. Now, before I get us into our some very concrete and specific tips around the self-care, I want to highlight this last piece of these two definitions of what we're going for. I said this in the beginning, but now I have the actual definitions here. We're going for not just surviving, not just getting through it, but actually thriving and having growth and transformation. And so all of the tips that I'm going to start outlining now in these remaining, the full remainder of our time together, are designed to be things that help you to do that, help you, and they're based on evidence, they're based on science, that help you to have this kind of what's known as post-traumatic growth, having that positive, transformative response out of crisis and out of trauma. And I am going to share a poll here. It's just a true or false one. So it should be quick and easy, but it's a question about resilience. Resilience is a character trait that some people have and others don't. True or false? Just give you a few seconds to respond to that. Okay, we've gotten about 2/3 of you. That's great. I'm just going to leave it up about 10 more seconds, see if we get a few more of you in on it. Okay, and I will close it here. And so you can see that we got quite a mixture, not quite 50-50, which I sometimes get, but a good number of you with both answers, because it can seem true. It can seem like some people just are more resilient than others. You just have it or you don't. Luckily and thankfully, everyone who wrote false are correct, that it is not something that you're either born with or not, as much as it may seem that way. That resilience really is something it's like a seed that can be planted, can be watered, can be nourished, can be nurtured, and can grow in everyone. And so here's one definition, that it's, again, that ability to thrive in the face of adversity. And I love the picture that I've shared, which you will also see here, along with a quote from Tupac that I think, to me, is even better than the clinical definition of resilience, that the rose that grows from the crack in the concrete. And so I collect actually pictures like this of flowers that grow out of concrete, out of tar, out of bricks, out of fences, out of gates, out of places where you would least expect them to grow, as a reminder of resilience. And so it's that post-traumatic growth and post-traumatic resilience is really what we're going for in terms of our focus on self-care here today. And Bridget, your question is a perfect lead into where we're going next with this, because no, I don't think it's all CBT based at all. I think that you can use multisensory approaches, you can use mindfulness approaches. There's other strategies that definitely help achieve this post-traumatic growth, and those are what I'm going to lay out in the next 15 or 20 minutes that we have together here. So that's exactly where I'm going with this. So thank you for that question. So as we think about, okay, everything that we've uncovered so far, everything we've talked about so far, secondary trauma, self-care, even how we supervise people in our programs, we want to have this approach that uses this ABCs of our way to remember it: the awareness, the balance, and the connection. So everything that we've covered up to this point in the webinar has been under that A category, about awareness, about knowing the definitions, knowing yourself, knowing how you respond, knowing the survival brain instincts, knowing the different kinds of trauma. All of that is part of that awareness, doing some of those self-tests that I gave you on the links. So you have an awareness of, where am I now? Then we move on to balance. We need to be able to seek some balance between when we're feeling those really just overwhelmed, the toxic stress, even the tolerable stress, but it's overwhelming us at the moment. When we're in those dark places, when we're in those hard places, we need to give ourselves and others, when we see them in those places, the grace and space to actually acknowledge, verbalize, talk about, write about, express those feelings, not deny them, not bury them, not say that they don't exist, not beat ourselves up for having them, but rather allowing for them before we pull ourselves back into some other place. So I'm going to ask a poll question related to this. And it says, saying aloud or writing down difficult or negative feelings, A, should be discouraged because it leads to more negative thinking, or B, it is healthy because it helps you not to get stuck in the negative space. C, it should only be done when not around children so you don't expose them to negative thoughts. Or D, is only safe when done in a therapist's office. Okay, I see we have about 2/3 of you, so I'm going to leave it up about 10 more seconds. All right, gonna close it out here. Share the results. So even though we did get a smattering of the other answers, the vast majority of you did select the answer I was going for. It is healthy because it helps you not to get stuck in the negative space. And that's what we're going for here. And that's why the idea here is to seek balance. It's not to deny or deflect or ignore those negative feelings, but it's also not to stay stuck in them. And so that's why I have this picture of the child on the balance beam. If you've ever watched someone master the balance beam, you know how they work very hard to stay in that balance. And if they have even a flicker getting them out of balance, they have to really pull themselves back into balance with intention. So you do have to allow those negative thoughts and feelings to have voice, because if you don't, then what can happen is the stress can accumulate, the anxiety can incubate, and not good things result from that. So allow it, but then pull yourself back into balance. And some of what we will be sharing in the next few minutes are some of the ways you do that, pulling yourself into balance. I'm going to go over with you now a series of what I call daily reflective questions. And you'll see that each of the questions is designated for something that I encourage you to ask yourself at a particular time of the day. And these are the things that I said at the beginning, and I've mentioned a couple of times, these are evidence-based. If you reflect on these questions and do the actions prompted by the questions, you have an evidence-based approach to self-care, resilience, and well-being. Reflecting on these questions and doing the activities that they prompt actually do build resilience and increase your likelihood to have post-traumatic growth, to kind of go back to Bridget's question there. So I want to encourage you to use the questions and to use a journal to write about them, to talk about them, to find ways that you can use them to help you with your self-care plan. So let's start with the first three of the questions are what I call the morning question. And these, you'll get these questions that are obviously here in the PowerPoint, but they're also all on a one-pager in the handouts that you will be receiving. So the first question, the first set are the three morning questions. Start your day and notice how each question is just asking you to think of one idea. Part of the value of these questions is that they give you that opportunity to be mindful and to focus on one thing at a time. And that really does help with our self-care. So start, before you even sort of put your feet on the floor and get out of bed, start thinking, what's one goal I have for today? Not what is my whole to-do list, not what is everything from yesterday's to-do list that I didn't quite finish. Don't beat yourself up, but just focus. What is one goal, one thing that I'll feel good about myself if I do it today? Who is one person I can turn to for support? Critically important to ask yourself that question, because connection, which is both this question and the next one, connection is the single most important thing you can do for your self-care. Connecting to someone every single day, recognizing I am not alone. I have at least one person that I can turn to in my life for self-care, for support. Well, even if you don't actually turn to them that day, just taking the moment to reflect and recognize I have someone in my corner is a big part of your self-care. And the flip side of that same question is the third one. Who is one person I'll reach out to today? I'll reach out to. And so related to that, I have a question to pose for you. Why is reaching out to others valuable? Reaching out to others during a time of stress, grief, or crisis. A, should it be handled by trained professionals? B, is it not a good idea if you're not equipped to solve their problem? C, can it be helpful for both people because connection is essential to coping and healing? Or D, is it something that can only be accomplished by in-person contact? Okay, about 2/3 of you have replied. I'll just keep it posted a few more seconds. Okay, we'll close it out now. And I love that so many of you know that it can be helpful for both people. So reaching out to someone, even in a supporting role, is not to drain more out of you, but it actually is to create that opportunity for connection that is the single most important thing you can do for your own self-care. I love that Kelsey has mentioned that because she has participated in this workshop before, she has the reflective questions. And look at that, she keeps them on her bedside table so she can start and end her day with them. That's fabulous. I love that. Thank you for sharing that. So I love this Brene Brown quote that goes along with this idea of connecting with others. We are hardwired for this. And without it, not only is there suffering, but as you see her note here, we don't have the meaning and the sense of purpose that connection gives us. Single most important thing you can do for your self-care. But then we will move on because also we're going to have some questions for what I call the lunchtime questions. Okay, take that lunch break. First of all, don't skip lunch. Even if you don't feel like eating a whole lot, take a pause, take a break. And when you do, take some time and focus on these 3 questions. What is one way I'll nourish and move my body today? You know, don't beat yourself up if you didn't really stick with your diet or your fitness plan or you didn't do everything you had intended. That's okay. As long as you think, well, at least one thing I'm going to do is going to be about nourishing my body today and moving my body. And in the same way, how will I nourish my mind and my spirit? Now, you might wonder about why that's important, so I am going to pose a poll question about that. It's important to move your body during periods of stress, grief, or trauma because trauma and grief are stored in your body and movement helps with coping and healing. That's A. Or B, you might gain weight from stress eating and being less active than usual. Or C, if you're exposed to the COVID-19 virus or something similar, you can sweat it out so you won't get sick. Or D, none of the above. So we've had about not quite half of you so far, so we'll leave it up a little bit longer. Okay, gonna close this one out. And great that so many of you know that trauma is stored in your body, so movement is going to help you with your coping and healing. Now, you might also get a weight loss or weight gain benefit from it, absolutely. And maybe even the one about sweating out the virus, you cannot sweat out the COVID-19 virus. That is not scientific. But body movement and nourishing and moving your body helps you increase your immunities for any kind of illnesses. So there is that little grain there of truth, although that particular one was kind of definitely a false statement. So I'm glad you didn't pick it. If none of those work for you, a few of you put none of the above, I would just like you to consider and recognize that trauma is stored in the body and that doing some movement each day does help you with your healing. So we'll close that one out. And now we're going to move on to the question that I call the tea time question. Now, if you can give yourself a tea break, a coffee break, something like that in the middle of the afternoon, I think that that would be ideal. That would be terrific. It's really valuable. Just give yourself, again, a little pause, a little time to reflect, a little time to have a break. But whether you actually do tea or any other thing during your break, take a moment during the day where you actually reflect on this question. What is one thing of beauty that I've seen or heard or created today? And for that process, use all of your five senses. What have I seen? What have I heard? What have I smelled? What have I touched? What has been beautiful in my life today? And taking that moment to reflect on it and to recognize it, to notice your senses throughout the day really helps with self-care. But it gets improved. The benefit you get from it increases when you share. Tell someone else. Tell someone else about that thing of beauty that you have seen or heard or created. Just post it on your social media. Call someone, text someone, and maybe that person will share theirs back with you. And that reciprocity, again, creates connection and it creates that sensory experience that is part of your self-care. I'm glad that some of you are finding this valuable. I'm appreciating the notes in the comment box. So yeah, please read each other's comments and use that as a way to stay connected with one another. And so another way you want to consider that question, that last one about the tea time, is also, do you get grounded and do you get yourself outside if at all possible? Because getting grounded and getting outdoor air and recognizing, the earth is still strong enough to hold me up, that is part of that self-care that also gives you that opportunity to reflect on something beautiful. So try to take that moment at least once a day to get grounded if you possibly can. Now we're moving on to, as you can see, we're getting closer to the end of the webinar. We're also getting closer to the end of the day in terms of these reflective questions. So the next set of 3 are what I call the dinner time questions. And I call them that intentionally because there is value in itself of having dinner or a meal, to the breaking of the bread, the fellowship of a meal together with other people, that is part of our self-care as well. So try, even if you live alone, maybe you can text someone, call someone, be on social media with someone during a mealtime, so you have this opportunity to have this feeling of connection even during a mealtime. And during that time, asking these questions: what is something I've learned today? A success I've had, maybe related to the goal I stated at the beginning of the day, maybe not so much, but just recognizing a success. And then one thing that made me smile or laugh. Humor is a really valuable part of our self-care strategy. And then we want to end both our webinar well, as well as ending our day well. We want to ensure that we kind of carry this reflectiveness and this self-care strategies into our evening. So we have what I give you as the 3 bedtime questions, the 3 evening questions. And I loved, again, that Kelsey had said she keeps hers right by the side of her bed, because that is the goal here, that you would actually have these, once you're already in your bed, kind of think about these 3 questions. What is one worry I can let go of? One thing at least, more than one is even better, that I can be grateful for, being intentional about gratitude. And then one thing I can look forward to for tomorrow, because hope, next to connection, hope and optimism are the next, connection is the single most important thing you can do for self-care, relational connections, and having a sense of hope and optimism is close on his heels as the second most important thing. And it can be something as simple as, I'm looking forward to the smell of my morning coffee. You just don't have to make it a big deal thing, but just knowing I have something that I'm looking forward to. And I just want to give you one little tip, one little strategy about letting go of a worry, and then I'm going to turn us over to the follow-up next steps and give us that opportunity for final questions. The worry that you want to let go of, you're probably still going to have to deal with tomorrow. Burning your worry or throwing it away or throwing it out the window or something is not going to really convince your mind, because it's still going to be there tomorrow. So my suggestion, my strategy is, write it down on a piece of paper, the worry that you're going to let go of while you sleep, and put it in a room, in a place that's separate from your sleeping environment. So you are literally and concretely telling your brain, I am not going to let this worry invade my sleep. It'll still be there. It'll still be in the kitchen or the office or the dining room, wherever you stick it. It'll still be there tomorrow, but it's not going to invade my sleep tonight. So on that note, that's the last of the reflective questions. I have just this quick little wrap up here that just reminds you of the things I've talked about in terms of your self-care strategies, to hold space for and acknowledge the hard feelings, but don't stay stuck in them. Simplify, but don't neglect your self-care plan by focusing on one thing at a time and the basics, and connect with another person every day. So with that in mind, I am going to turn it back to Gail to just remind us of the follow-up steps and to let me know if there's any questions that I can answer in these final few minutes.
Well, Sue, as always, it was fabulous. You always take my breath away with your presentation. Do we have any questions at all that you would like to put in the chat box and I can read them and Sue can answer them? If you have any, please do that now. We have time for maybe one or two. I did get a question about, can you speak more about PTSS?
Post-traumatic slave syndrome, and Joy DeGray is definitely the person who coined the term and a leading expert. You would want to look up some of her YouTube videos, but it is a particular iteration or a particular form of multi-generational trauma that there are outgrowths of how the trauma that was experienced by generations in slavery actually can be carried into the lives of people today, generations later, who don't have their own personal experience with slavery. So it is a form of multi-generational and historic trauma that has a present day reality of how it affects people of today. And I would love to encourage you to read Dr. Joy DeGray to learn more about that.
Oh, thank you. And Emily would like to know, are there any tips for supervisors trying to support their workforce with secondary trauma and self-care?
I do have lots of tips about that. That's a whole topic actually for a whole separate workshop, but I think if supervisors can especially learn about a type of supervision called reflective supervision, and that's the topic that I said is kind of a second separate whole workshop, but reflective supervision, using the supervisory process to really guide those that you supervise into the capacity to be more reflective rather than just sort of checklist oriented. Reflective supervision has what's called the 3 building blocks of reflection, collaborative problem solving. So in supervision, you're collaboratively solving issues together with the person you supervise rather than being, dictating, do this, do that, or just saying, figure it out, without going on either extreme, but having the collaborative process. And the third step is regularity. So reflection, collaboration, regularity, kind of the building blocks of reflective supervision.
Well, thank you. I think that's about enough time that we can answer for questions. I did see that people are asking about the slides, and the copy of this webinar will be on our events page for NASTAC. So you can go there and listen to the whole presentation again. I want to thank Sue again for today, and thank you everyone for participating. A special thanks goes to our NASTAC Communications Manager, Kelsey Engelbrad, and Michelle Covington, our project manager, for helping us run today's webinar.